So we have at least 2 decades back, we did not have counters. Till about 98, 99, we just had the Newbar chamber for counting the WBC and the RBC count, and the microscope for counting the differential count. So when the counter was first came to our hematology lab, we were all so thrilled. Within a few seconds, you get reports. I mean, everything you get in a small piece of paper. That was really amazing to see. And the, I mean, we were just wonderstruck. And of course, we did cross check. Initial stages, we used to cross check everything with the Newbar chamber too. And after that, we realized that it's more or less foolproof way of getting the reports. And we only started cross checking whenever we had doubts. So thanks to the inventors of cell counters, it's made the life very easy. So the few advantages of Coulter CBC report is very inexpensive to run, and you get fast reports, gives valuable information. That's what we're going to see in today's talk. Requires the other major advantages. It requires a very few microliter of blood. Unlike your total count, differential count, you need at least an ml of EDTA sample. Here you need a few drops of blood only, and gives valuable information like total count, differential count, RBC count, platelet volume, the indices, hemoglobin, and hematocrit. And the other advantage is low and high values are flagged. There is an alarm that is raised saying that it's a warning for you. Something is wrong, please accordingly you tackle. And also provides a very valuable information, what is called as blood cell histograms, which has significant potential to provide diagnostically relevant information, which I'll be going through in the subsequent slides. So what is the principle of Coulter? A little let's go back to our physics. We always know that when the particles pass through an orifice along with an electrical current, it produces an increase in impedance due to the displacement of electrolytes which are present in the particle. This change in impedance is proportional to the volume of the particle. This is the principle that is used in Coulter. So volume of cell is the basis of differentiation. As we all know, the volume of cells are different. The platelets are 2 to 25 and the RBCs are the next. And then you have the WBCs. That's how, based on their volume, they get separated. So there are different types of Coulter counters. Basic model is 3 parameters differential, where you get only the granulocytes, lymphocytes, and monocytes. And 5 parameters differential, where you get lymphocytes, monocytes, neutrophils. Along with that, you get eosinophils and basophils too. We have 7 parameter differential, 8 parameter differential, where you get immature platelet fraction, reticulocyte count, and others too. So yeah, nucleated red blood cell counts and immature granulocytes are the 6th and 7th, and the 8th is the immature platelet fraction. So depending upon what model you're using, you can get 3 parameter, 5 parameter, 6, 7 parameter, or 8 parameters. So 3-part differential is neutrophils get separated, lymphocytes, and then you have the eosinophils, monocytes, and the basophils. And the 5-part is the 3-part, all of them are together, and only the monocytes are usually visualized. The 5-part, you can visualize them individually. So report is always available in 2 formats, the numbers on the left and the graphs on the right. But unfortunately, we only look at the numbers and only certain numbers like hemoglobin, total count, platelet count. We are only worried about those 3. We don't look into the details of others. And available information on the graphs is something that we are not used to interpreting. That's what I will try to explain to you, how to interpret the graphs too. So this is how the WBC scatter looks like. The lymphocyte on the left, the neutrophils on the right, the monocytes, basophils, and eosinophils in the center. So the histograms, if you look at the red cell histogram, there are different histograms: red cell histogram, WBC histogram, and platelet histogram. So red cell histogram, you have, if the RBCs are larger than normal, it gets shifted to the right. If it is smaller, like in macrocytosis, you have the curve shifted to the right. In microcytosis, it gets shifted to the left, and it remains bimodal when there are 2 populations of RBCs. Similarly, platelets, again, when the MPV is high, it gets shifted to the right. And where there are platelet aggregates, microerythrocytes, all those things make it shifted to the right. And when you have microthrombocytes, it goes to the left. WBC again, So you can see the lymphocytes, you can see the region of overlap, the monocytes, and then the granulocytes. So this is the center region where you have overlap of monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So this curve is nicely seen. You can see different curves. So you know that this patient has got lymphocytosis, relative neutropenia, and there are some monocytes. That's how you interpret. So after going through the basics in Coulter counter, how different it is from your other ways of looking at the total counts and the differential counts, we move on to different cases. So this is an 8-year-old girl who was referred for evaluation of gross pallor. The primary pediatrician got really panicked when he saw her. She went for some other illness, and when he looked at her, she was grossly pale, and he was really worried, and he referred her to our ER. This is during the COVID pandemic, sometime in the month of November, December, before I came to USA. So this girl's, if you look at the counter reports, the hemoglobin is just 4.5, and the total count and the differential count look normal. Platelets also look okay. Retic count is only 1.2%. MCV is low, MCH, MCHC or low, and RDW is on the higher side. So look at this girl. She was a Muslim girl. Can you all see this picture? So when I saw her palms and soles, then she was a Muslim girl and she was wearing a hijab. So I just said, okay, remove your hijab. I want to look at your neck nodes. When I removed the hijab, this is what I saw. I mean, we saw live lice moving also. Look at the infestation of lice onto the entire hair, causing a hemoglobin of 4.5. So this is one of the bad effects of lockdown. The parents were really educated, but they were really apologetic, and they felt very embarrassed because entire lockdown period, this girl has not had a proper head bath. She's not had proper combing of hair, and the routine got so upset that this girl would refuse the mother to touch her hair. So this was really bad, and we immediately got the diagnosis. We did not order any further investigations. We knew that it was iron deficiency anemia. This was the smear picture, which confirmed our diagnosis about typical microscopic microcytic hypochromic anisocytosis. And the diagnosis was iron deficiency anemia, secondary to intense lice infestation. So we immediately got her tonsured. Immediately we sent her to the um, because it was of COVID era, I mean, we couldn't do it in foolproof method in our own ER. Previously, we had a similar child about 2-3 years back for whom we did the tonsuring in the ER itself. But this girl, because she was an older girl and the hair was thick and dense, we sent her to the nearby. The parents took her to the nearby beauty parlor and got her fully tonsured and brought her back. And then we started her on oral iron supplements. We didn't even admit her. So that tells you the importance of clinical examination. If I hadn't removed the hijab and I would have just looked at the pallor, then I would have ordered a battery of investigations and I would have probably admitted her too. So there lies the importance of good physical examination. Moving on to the next, little about red cell distribution because there was a lot of questioning about RDW in the previous talk too. See, it's actually a coefficient of variation in red cell volume distribution. So it's an objective evidence of anisocytosis that is seen in the peripheral smear. If you have severe anisocytosis, the RDW goes up. So normal range is 11.5 to 14.5. So this table is a very useful table. The RDW is normal, but the MCV is low. Think of thalassemia trait. RDW is normal, MCV is normal. That is the normal thing that is expected. RDW is normal, MCV is high, then think of something to do with the liver or aplastic anemia. When the RDW is high and the MCV is low, think of iron deficiency anemia. When the RDW is high and the MCV is normal, think of sickle cell anemia, chronic liver disease, or malignancy. When the RDW is high and the MCV is high, think of megaloblastic anemia or autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So this is a very simple, you can actually take a screenshot of this. It's a very useful tool for you to quickly interpret and go ahead accordingly. So this is a very useful thing that I thought I should share with you. Moving on to the next case. So this is a 6 months old child who was brought for evaluation of developmental delay. So this apparently they were living in a joint family, and the other children of similar age group had already started transferring objects, started crawling, head holding was there, but this particular child at 6 more months did not have a proper head control, was very not communicative at all, wouldn't really like to play with the um, I mean, wouldn't really like to follow objects or transfer objects. So the parents were really worried. Again, they were very educated. So on looking at the child, child was pale, fairly nourished, depigmented hair, and hyperpigmented knuckles. The hemoglobin was 5.6. Total count was 2,800 with a normal differential. Platelet count was 80,000. We have a high MCV. MCV is 110. MCH is 23, MCHC is 24, and RDW is 26. So this was the typical hyperpigmented knuckles that we saw in this child. So I think the answer was staring at us. There were hypersegmented neutrophils and macrocytes in the corresponding peripheral smear that we ordered, and we made a diagnosis of megaloblastic anemia. The message that I want to convey through this case is megaloblastic anemia is one underdiagnosed condition that I think right now I see a lot of children getting diagnosed because of our city pediatric meets in Chennai, where we discuss difficult cases every third Wednesday. I think there's a lot of eye-opening done with megaloblastic anemia. Typically, these children infants come with developmental delay, lack of the cognitive communication skills are not there. They're very lethargic. And if you carefully look, you have this depigmented hair and you have the hyperpigmentation. And whenever you have an infant with megaloblastic anemia, two other things that you have to look for is one is look for urine proteinuria. If there is urine proteinuria, think of Imerslund-Grasbeck syndrome. The importance is if it is Imerslund-Grasbeck syndrome, the child will need a longer duration of intramuscular B12, and usually they don't respond to oral B12 because the intestinal absorption of B12 is also a part of intestinal absorption of B12 and the tubular reabsorption of proteins. Both are encoded by the same protein. That particular protein is deficient. So this particular child, if you give oral B12, will not respond. This child will need only intramuscular. As against nutritional megaloblastic anemia, where you can switch over to oral B12 after some time. Maybe after 6 months, if you want, you can switch over to oral B12, which is available nowadays. So that's another, that one more thing that you should look for in an infant with megaloblastic anemia is look for urine sugar too. Apart from looking at the urine protein, also look at urine sugar. And if the urine sugar is positive, look at blood sugar and also test the hearing. TRMA, thiamine responsive megaloblastic anemia, can present with hearing loss and hyperglycemia. Again, the treatment is different. That's why I'm stressing on looking at these two aspects. The treatment is thiamine along with B12 and not B12 alone. These particular children will not respond to B12 alone. It's rewarding. The treatment is rewarding. Molecular diagnosis, genomic diagnosis is available to confirm if the same infant has a urine glucosuria and hearing loss. Think of thiamine plus or minus hearing loss. Think of thiamine responsive megaloblastic anemia. Moving on to the case 3, this is a 15 months old child, firstborn of consanguineous parents. Again, the pallor was noticed by the pediatrician when the child went for a routine immunization. Also had hepatosplenomegaly. If you look at the counts, you can see the hemoglobin is 3.5, RBC count is reduced, total count is 60,000 with a lymphocytic predominance. Platelet looks okay, and the indices are not really abnormal. They all look okay. So what do you think is going on here? Is it a malignancy? There is hepatosplenomegaly, there is pallor, the counts are high, and the hemoglobin is low. There is bicytopenia definitely, but what's happening to the platelet count? it looks normal. So let's see what's exactly happening. So this is actually a common thing that you encounter. The total count is high because the nucleated RBCs are counted as WBC. So the counter is actually a programmed, something like a programmed computer. It just counts, as I discussed in the first few slides, it just looks at the volume and counts and separates them. It doesn't know that it is nucleated RBC. Nucleated RBCs are huge and they resemble lymphocytes. So it gets counted as a lymphocyte or a granulocyte. So total count goes up in the bargain. And when you have such picture, 15 months old who's otherwise okay, mother says the child is fine. She's not noticed anything different in the child. Child is feeding well, child is growing well. But pallor was noticed by the pediatrician and hepatosplenomegaly was identified by the pediatrician. If this is the case, always think of thalassemia. So usual age of presentation of thalassemia is sometime around the latter part of the infancy, 8th or 9th month. Till about 1.5 years, the HPF protects them and they don't require that much of transfusion. So this is a thalassemia major and the nucleated RBCs are counted as WBC. You can look at the number of nucleated RBCs which were counted as WBC. So you do the hemoglobin electrophoresis and then you get the diagnosis. So this is thalassemia major. Moving on to the next case, 7-year-old girl had low-grade fever, vomiting, high-colored urine of 1 week duration. She was pale, prick and spleen was palpable, and she was treated as viral hepatitis with native medicines prior to coming to our hospital. When we looked at the history, the mother had a history of cholecystectomy. So um, this is again a common mistake that is done. Whenever they come with history of fever, vomiting, and high-colored urine, and you just look at the clinically, you look at them and then make a diagnosis of viral hepatitis. They get away with being treated as viral hepatitis. But what actually is different in this child, instead of the liver being palpable, the spleen is palpable, and the mother has a history of cholecystectomy. So this is classically, if you see the MCHC is high. One condition where the MCHC is very high is hereditary spherocytosis. In all the other conditions, if you look, MCHC will be normal. Here, the MCHC will be high. So this is hereditary spherocytosis. So you can see spherocytes in the picture here, again spherocytes, so that confirms your diagnosis. So again, if you don't examine these children, they keep coming to you with episodes of hemolysis presenting with high colored urine and scleral icterus, which is triggered by simple URI, simple febrile illness. So if you don't make the child lie down and examine, and if you don't look at the peripheral smear, and if you don't interpret the indices, you'll label her as recurrent hepatitis, and you'll start referring her to a hepatologist and start working her on those lines. So this is very simple, and this has happened to many of our children too. They would be treated outside as recurrent viral hepatitis. They would have gone to Star Theatre and got the Unani medicines. And when they come to us, when we look at the spleen and look at the indices and order for a peripheral smear, we have a diagnosis. These particular children may not need transfusion, so they get missed. So the importance is look for gallstones, because over a period of time they develop gallstones, and also start them on early folic acid supplements. So the final diagnosis is hereditary spherocytosis. Moving on to the fifth case, 1-year-old boy presented with fever, coryza of 1 week duration, sudden onset of high colored urine just the day morning. Last 1 week, child was been having low-grade fever and coryza. Mother has been contacting us over the phone. We've been reassuring her. And because they are regular patients of ours, we just told them warning symptoms and report whenever the child is. This was, I think, during the dengue season. So when she said fever, no fever, child is active, playful, we kept checking the warning signs because they were staying quite far away from the hospital. And we told them to come back if there are any warning symptoms. This mother noticed sudden onset of high colored urine, which was not there in our list of warning signs, but still she was an educated mother and she reported immediately to the emergency room, pallor, puffiness, and breathlessness. So on examination, the child was pale, icteric, and tachypnic, and the spleen was palpable. Hemoglobin was 6.5. Total count was 18,000 with a good differential. Platelet count was 2.5 lakhs. MCV was 100. Retic was 8%. Bilirubin was 4.3 and the DCT was 3 plus. The emergency room PG was a very smart PG. As soon as he looked at a high MCV with a hemoglobin of 6.5 and a retic of 8%, immediately he thought of hemolytic anemia. He ordered a DCT and he called me with all the reports. So this is the advantage of having postgraduates, really good postgraduates in the emergency room. Your job is made very simple. So this is the picture. He also took a picture of the high colored urine and sent, and you can see this is the aggregated. There's a lot of agglutination of RBCs. That's the reason you get a high MCV in these children. So it was autoimmune hemolytic anemia. The same child, I didn't put that picture, he also ordered an X-ray. An X-ray showed a small suggestive of some patch, streaky opacities. And so immediately I told him to order for an mycoplasma IgM. So one message here is, whenever you have an autoimmune hemolytic anemia with fever and respiratory symptoms, think of coexisting mycoplasma pneumonia and order for a mycoplasma IgM for academic purposes and confirmation of your diagnosis. And these children, the message is they improve very well with treatment of the mycoplasma pneumonia, and you don't need to start on steroids or you don't even need to transfuse them. Many of them improve very well with symptomatic treatment of mycoplasma pneumonia. So that is the message from this case. Moving on to the next case, 45 days old female infant, splenohepatomegaly with pallor noted incidentally by pediatrician during routine immunization visit. See, in all my cases, if you see, most of these children are diagnosed by the primary pediatricians. So again, the message is we are having very good primary level pediatricians these days, thanks to the regular CME programs, and they are really updated, and gone are the days when they just miss the diagnosis and refer. Most of the time, they give us the clue to the primary diagnosis, and they even highlight the abnormalities and refer them to us. So I think kudos to my regular referring pediatricians. They're all really good. This child did not have any fever, bleeds, or jaundice. If you look at the total count, it was on the higher side. Hemoglobin was 5.6. Platelet count was 60,000. You have a differential which is not very alarming. The renal and the liver functions, the primary pediatrician was worried because he ordered the battery of tests and referred. So he was thinking of malignancy. Even we, when we saw the child, we thought of malignancy. But this is the picture that we had of the peripheral smear. This is a typical leukoerythroblastic picture. So any clues? What is the next investigation you would like to order in this child? Anyone can type in the chat box too. So this is osteoclastic disorder. The next investigation that you would order is X-ray, long bones, or whatever. Even an X-ray chest you can order. You can see these dense bones. So the diagnosis is osteopetrosis. So this leukoerythroblastic picture is because the bone marrow is really displaced by a lot of abnormal cells, which give a picture of something like an acute myeloid leukemia. So it's a leukoerythroblastic picture, which is characteristically seen in children with osteopetrosis. They usually get referred as acute myeloid leukemia because you have more of the leukoblasts in the peripheral smear, and also the child correspondingly has pallor, hepatosplenomegaly, high total count, low platelet count. So I'm sure the pediatrician is not wrong in suspecting AML, but one message is look at the X-ray if you have a doubt, and also look at the neurological, some clues you will have in these children. They may have nystagmus, they may not be following light, so they may have some visual impairment because osteopetrosis, they can have hearing loss, they can have visual impairment. So if you're an astute clinician, also look at these subtle signs, which will give you a clue that you're dealing with osteopetrosis. Moving on to the next case, 3-year-old boy came with intermittent fever of 1 month, reduced activity, limb pains, gross pallor, mucosal bleeds, generalized lymphadenopathy, and gross hepatosplenomegaly. I think the diagnosis is staring at you. This is just for completion. I added this case. Hemoglobin is 6, total count is 2,800. You have a lymphocytic predominance, low platelet count, indices look okay. So this is staring at you. The only thing is the limb pains is very, very important. These are usually pains that wake up the child in the night. So that's how you differentiate it from growing pains. Growing pains usually settle down with just a local massage and some pain relievers, local pain reliever rub, whereas this particular pain, bone pain, doesn't improve with just massaging, and the child has other features like if you see fever of 1 month, pallor, mucosal bleeds, I don't think anyone will have a doubt in diagnosing this child. So this is lymphoblasts and the peripheral smear and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So again, messages: do not try to treat these children at your level, at the primary care level. Refer them as quickly as possible to the to the oncology center, because these children will need irradiated red blood cells. They'll need further workup. They may have complications of, they may have febrile neutropenia. They may have tumor lysis syndrome. So don't treat these children unless you're having an expertise to treat these children, and do not start them on steroids or any other medications. It's okay if you start them on antibiotics, but not on steroids, and refer them early. Moving on to the next case, this is a 6-year-old girl, previously well, playful child, insidious onset of skin and mucosal bleeds of 3 days duration. There's no pallor, nodes, or organomegaly. Hemoglobin is 12. You have a normal total and a differential count. Platelet count is 20,000. Mean platelet volume is 11.2. This is one case where you have to look at the MPV, and if the IPF is available, also look at the IPF. I'll talk a little about IPF. This is the classical picture that she had. A lot of petechiae, purpura, ecchymosis, everything. So ITP, this of course I know, I think all of you know the diagnosis. This is immune thrombocytopenic purpura. So these children are usually, they just run around in the outpatient department. You can't even hold them and examine them. So that's why the parents delay in coming to the hospital, because they think that something, she's hurt herself. She's so playful that she's hurt herself, and she's having some bleeds, and they wait and watch. And when it starts increasing in severity, involving almost the entire part of the body, and also develops mucosal bleeds, they become alert, and they bring them to the hospital. Strikingly, the child is otherwise very well. There is no, pallor is not a major problem in these children unless they have severe mucosal bleeds causing severe anemia. That is very unlikely in your children with straightforward ITP. So they don't have power nodes, they don't have organomegaly, they have isolated platelet count being low and an MPV which is high. If you have an IPF, the immature platelet fraction, some of the latest new age counters also have IPF. And immature platelet fraction is again a very good tool for you to really send away these patients, reassure and send them, because that's a marker of giant platelets. Apart from your MPV, immature platelet fraction, anything above 7 is suggestive of your large platelets, and you can always reassure them. You don't have to really, if the child is otherwise well, I think I would just um, probably give them an option of oral steroids or IVIG. And if they opt for steroids, then I would document the bone marrow, because still in our setup, we are really worried and we don't want to take a chance. We better document a bone marrow and then start them on oral steroids. Just a daycare, morning you admit, do a bone marrow, get the report, start them on oral steroids and send them home. Or if they are not willing for a bone marrow, you can just admit them and give intravenous immunoglobulin, because mucosal bleed and a low platelet count of 20,000 are not advisable to send the child home. Mucosal bleeds are forerunners of intracranial bleeds, and anything that is around 20,000 or less than 20,000, it's better to intervene. So this is immune thrombocytopenic purpura. Moving on to the next case, we have a 10-year-old boy with progressive pallor of 2 months duration. So this boy has been becoming pale in front of the eyes of the parents. And he also had some early morning puffiness of the face, the feet. And the last 1 week, he's been a little breathless. The primary pediatrician who saw him about 2 months back thought he was a fussy eater, and because he was also retarded in growth, so he thought he was a fussy eater and put him on oral iron and B12, which did not lead to any improvement. So when he was brought to our hospital, we got the counts done. The hemoglobin was 6, the near normal total and differential count and a platelet count. The indices don't look, the RDW is low and the hemoglobin MCV is also around, looks normal. Retic count is 1%. So this is like little confusing for us. What are we dealing with? A 10-year-old boy, progressive pallor, but nothing alarming in the total count. What's happening? So we went further into the history and did a good clinical examination. So this is normocytic normochromic anemia, if you see. The MCV is normal, the MCH is normal, the MCHC is normal, RDW is normal, but hemoglobin is 6. So this is normochromic normocytic anemia. We've looked at microcytic, we looked at macrocytic. This is one example of normocytic normochromic anemia where retic count plays a vital role. When you do a retic count, and if it is increased, then think of hemolytic anemia or post-hemorrhage. If it is normal or decreased, then you may have to venture into a bone marrow. If the bone marrow is normal, think of your systemic diseases. And if it is abnormal, think of your malignancies like hypoplastic anemia, leukemia, lymphoma, myelofibrosis, and so on and so forth. What's happening in this child? The retic count is low. So what are we left with? I mean, normal or decreased. So are we going to do a bone marrow on this child who's so pale and puffy and having some clues the child is trying to tell you? So what you can type in the chat box what you would like to do for this child. So this child, we went ahead and measured the anthropometry. It was height and weight was less than third centile. BP recordings were consistently high for age. We measured different people in the OP measured. The nurse measured, then we measured. We did the NIBP, we did the manual BP, we did on the left arm, we did on the right arm, and then we ordered a creatinine because of the edema. Creatinine was 3.5. So this is something, the message that I want to convey to you. This is chronic renal failure. So this is again one important thing that we should never forget. Any child who comes to you who's sick, who's been referred, please do not forget to do a complete physical examination. I insist on blood pressure recording by the nurses outside when they measure the weight and the height. The other parameter that I ask them to measure is the blood pressure. In fact, I call and shout at them when there is no BP recording. So it's very, very important. What's wrong in getting a BP recording? Nowadays, I think during this last 1 year, our outpatient census has been a little low. We have to do a complete clinical examination, whether it is, I mean, that's not the, you should never compromise on the vital parameters, even if the outpatient is busy, at least leave it for sick children, at least get the blood pressure measured. I still remember Dr. Namalwa's teaching, how he usually manually records the blood pressure for all these children. You would never believe the NIBP apparatus. So do not forget blood pressure measurement on all children who are referred, who are sick, and who are well when you have a lighter clinic. So this child, the blood pressure gave us the clue, and we thought the pallor, high blood pressure, edema. We thought it was APSGN and ordered a creatinine that was 3.5. But this child's symptoms are going on for a longer time, and there is no high colored urine for you to, cola colored urine was not there. And this is quite a longer duration. APSGN doesn't present like this. It's usually a very acute, like your autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Maybe duration can be about a week duration, but not 2 months. So that made us think of CRF, and we did an ultrasound and found bilateral contracted kidneys, and we referred them to the nephrologist. Coming to the last case of the day, it's a 4-year-old child treated for dengue shock in the intensive care unit. The second week of illness, the child was shifted out of ICU because the child was off inotropes and was okay. Vitals were stable, off inotropes. In the ward, child had a new onset fever with no identified focus. All cultures were sterile, all the long lines were removed. We in fact removed the jugular line, the central venous line, the intraarterial catheter, of course, was out. When the child was out of ICU, the urinary catheter was removed. We got all cultures done, all were sterile, but the fever was really worrying because it was quite high grade and continuous. When we ordered the counts, hemoglobin was 9, total count was 1800 with a normal differential. Platelet count was 30,000. PTA-PTT was normal because he was a child with dengue who was recovering. We ordered PTA-PTT, which was initially abnormal, which returned to normal. Ferritin was 75,000. I think you all have an answer here. So this is a very common scenario in all our ICUs during the dengue season. It's infection associated hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. The clues are you have to look for any child who's recovering, not only dengue, any viral illness. Once the child recovers from the viral infection, the child comes to you with a new onset fever, has bicytopenia, and also this child has actually having a bicytopenia, and also look for a splenomegaly. You may be lucky to get a spleen, and or look at the criteria for HLH. Try to demonstrate the hemophagocytic cells in the bone marrow. You have the revised criteria. I'm not going into that. You can always go through your textbooks and get the revised criteria. So you have bicytopenia, new onset fever, high ferritin, and plus or minus splenomegaly, plus or minus bone marrow involvement. And they also have liver involvement. They have a high transaminases. Then you make a diagnosis of infection associated HLH. This is again a very um, challenging scenario which is faced often in our ICUs during the dengue season. They are not sure whether to treat these children as sepsis or as HLH. So if you're going to treat them as sepsis, you're just going to give antibiotics and wait and watch. But if you're going to suspect HLH, you're going to give them steroids, which is the mainstay of treatment in a child with secondary HLH or IVIG. But if usually this happens in older children who are very obese adolescents, and IVIG, if you're going to give them, it's like giving them something like a huge dose which the parents cannot afford. So it's a very usual dilemma that the intensivists face. I mean, now I think the criteria are more refined and we have other diagnostic modalities. So we really, the dilemma is not there as much as it was before. So I think I've gone through about 10 cases, and a glance at the, I mean, I think now you would have understood the importance of looking at the small bit of paper like a credit card statement which comes to you. A little bit of advice, these are actually thermal papers and they usually get, the values get erased immediately. So either take a photocopy, or you nowadays you have a phone, smartphone, you can take a photograph of that. Otherwise, if you stick it on the patient's case sheet, it gets erased. Take a photocopy and stick it. So that's the message I wanted to convey. And remember to look at all the values and the histogram. A glance at leukocytosis when you have, think of stress response, which again was dealt with in the previous talk too. Don't think that stress response comes only when the child has a seizure. It can come when the child has hypoxia. A child with bronchiolitis, if you do a total count, it will be 30,000. A child with chronic hypoxia, a CF child who comes to you, the total count will be always around 30, 35,000. A child who has acute onset vomiting, erosive gastritis, hematemesis, EHPO presenting with acute bout of hematemesis, counts will be high. A child with a road traffic accident, fall from a height, definitely will have a high total count. So these are all other causes of increased leukocyte count. For these are all other stress responses which I thought I should inform you. Of course, we all know that pneumonia, UTI, abscess, CNS infection, inflammatory disorders, you suspect all these when you have leukocytosis. Also suspect MISC because COVID is going to be there with us for the next year too, and we have MISC usually after the peak of COVID subsides. Leukopenia, again, viral enteric malaria, drug-induced malignancies, again, COVID, MISC. You can have leukopenia. Unlike adults, you don't have that much of a lymphopenia in children. We do have seen some of the adolescents with COVID pneumonia having lymphopenia, but the typical neutrophil lymphocytic ratio, the NLR of more than 3.5, we don't see that much in children. Thrombocytopenia, again, viral infections, enteric fever, malaria, collagen vascular diseases, hemophagocytic syndromes, and malignancies. Thrombocytosis, coexisting nutritional anemia, inflammatory disorders, and Kawasaki-like presentation of MISC. So whatever said and done, even though you have a counter, I think no one can underestimate the value of a microscope. You have an abnormal flagged report, go back and cross-check with your microscope. That's very, very important. And take-home messages at the end of my talk would be interpret all cell lines together. Don't look at one and immediately jump and say, okay, this child has got anemia. Look at the total count, look at the differential count, look at the platelet count, look at all the indices, look at other markers like uretic, MPV and all if it is available. Always calculate the ANC and ALC. ALC, the other condition where you have severe lymphopenia is your SCID, primary immune deficiency. SCID is one condition, your child presents very sick with recurrent infections and prolonged fever, and you have a lymphocyte count that is very low. Think of SCID and order for a flow cytometry. Cross-check with a good peripheral smear study. Never, dilute the importance of a peripheral smear study. Utilize retic count in children with anemia and utilize MPB and IPF in children with thrombocytopenia. Correlate always with history and clinical findings. Like the child with the first case with iron deficiency anemia secondary to lice, because of the clinical finding of the lice infestation, we could make a diagnosis. And the child with CRF, because of the history and because of further extended clinical examination, we could make a diagnosis of CRF. So I think I conclude with this and I would take questions. Thank you, sir.
Yes, madam. Ismail, sir?
Yeah, thank you, madam. It was a very lucid and a very informative messages you have given to all the practicing pediatricians, and you have approached the subject in a different perspective. I think it is really an eye-opener for all the practicing pediatrician to have it's just like a desktop recorder. I think we need to think, you made us to think in what way we can approach the children in an easy way. Thank you, madam. Thanks for the excellent lecture.
I made it short because already the whole Sunday has been too long for all of you. I think all of you have to get some good dinner and rest.
Yes, I understand, madam, but it was your mesmerizing voice made us really cool, madam. Thank you.
Okay.
Fantastic, madam. Fantastic, madam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Palniram.
Wonderful presentation. Thanks. Wonderful, madam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amal, I think you can take over the questions, sir.
Yes, sir. In fact, we have I think madam has made the topic dealt the topic very exhaustively, and in fact, she has cleared all of our doubts. I think there's not much of questions, but we have one question from Dr. Shrugurunadan, sir, regarding, shall we start steroids for ITP before bone marrow study is done in the peripheral setting? That's the question.
Again, it's a very controversial area. I mean, even recently, I think 2 years back in one of the pedicons, there was a panel discussion between Nitin Shah, Anupam Sachdeva sir, and me were there in the panel. Again, I think even from the West, the message that Nitin Shah and Anupam Sachdeva gave in the end was, do not start on steroids without doing a bone marrow. Why I'm saying this is, sometimes you can have a megakaryocytic thrombocytopenia. So that is a forerunner of malignancy. If you do a bone marrow, you'll see there are no megakaryocyte precursors. Normally in ITP, you're supposed to see a lot of megakaryocyte precursors. That is the confirmatory thing for knowing that because there is a peripheral destruction of platelets, automatically there is an increased production of megakaryocytes in the bone marrow. So that is the normal response that you expect in a child with ITP. But why we are insisting on a bone marrow is sometimes you can have malignancy, sometimes a megakaryocytic. I have had a patient in my own practice. It was an a megakaryocytic thrombocytopenia. We told them that it was ITP, and anyhow, they were doctor parents. Anyhow, we said we'll do a bone marrow because they opted for steroids. And we did a bone marrow, and to us, there were no megakaryocytes in the bone marrow, and we had to tell them the diagnosis of a megakaryocytic thrombocytopenia, and we referred them to CMC Vellore. And later, during our referral, they said like the girl's maternal aunt also had a similar condition, and she died in CMC Vellore before a transplant. So that is the importance. If you want to start steroids, please do a bone marrow. And at least give, if you're not able to having a proper person to interpret, at least send them with the slides to a good lab where you have a good pathologist. And I think I would not give steroids without doing a bone marrow. That's my take on that. IVIG, fine, you're welcome to give IVIG without bone marrow, but steroids, no, a big no.
That was a crisp and clear answer, ma'am. I think there are a lot of appreciations for you, madam, from almost most of the participants. I think they have all got thrilled by your presentation. If there are any more questions, I think they can post the question in the chat box, or they can direct the question
directly approach me.
Madam also.
So I just wanted to convey all simple messages to the practicing pediatrician. As I mentioned, all of you are my referring pediatricians who are all excellent. You all make a diagnosis and refer. I'm proud to say that I have a good group of pediatricians who refer to me with a diagnosis. But I mean, these are simple things. Remember to measure blood pressure in your OP. Remember to strip the child and examine. Remember to get a good history. Wait, make the parents wait. They will be anxious, make them wait. See, the girl on the first case that I saw, immediately the postgraduate started writing a big list of investigations. DCT, LDH, uric acid, he thought it was malignancy. But no one wanted to examine the child. So because of COVID also, they were all going back, not examining. So I told the girl, okay, I wore 2 masks and I said, please remove your hijab first. And when she removed the hijab, the entire ER team was into surprise. In fact, some PGs were starting to take videos of the live lice moving. Of course, the parents were very, very upset and embarrassed. So that's why I didn't share the face of the child. I promised to them that I will not share the face of the child. She was grossly pale. So what I'm saying is you end up not ordering so many investigations when you have a clue in the clinical examination. So that's the importance. Otherwise, I think I don't have anything else to say. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Ismail, Dr. Rajendran, and Malraj. Thanks for the opportunity. Please have the rest of the evening for yourself. I didn't want to.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye, sir.
Ajit sir, good evening. Unmute பண்ணிக்கிங்க. வாய்ஸ் கேட்கல.
மைக் சரியில்லைன்னு நினைக்கிறேன். அந்த மைக் my mic is not working. சார்
கேக்குது சொல்லுங்க.
You heard.
சரி. சார் நான் ரொம்ப பிஸியா வேற வேலைகள்ல இருக்கறனால வர முடியல. Further I will come. The presentation was very good. Anyhow, we feel that many of our pediatricians are not joining the meeting as before like anything. Today I attended one of the meeting conducted by Dr. Ibrahim. He conducted on behalf of his hospital. I told your involvement in the activities, and our Tirunelveli and Thoothukudi and the Tenkasi chapter will improve our activities in further course. I too very busy with some of the few of the activities. Definitely from our side we will join more. I think that the only thing is we pray God that COVID should reach a peak and should come when Ismail sir, when will we come down, sir? Like last September.
Yes,
$1 million question. It lies in the hands of the people, sir, public.
Yes, definitely.
I think we all should start sending messages to our parents and our relatives who are non-medical people to understand. I think recently there was a message by an orthopedic surgeon which was going viral. It was really good message. I think we should make them understand the importance of wearing masks and vaccine.
Doctors are not ready, madam. When it was started in January 16, and still we are back in immunization schedule. We started in our hospital from March 1st. Only from yesterday people have started coming, and there is really the supply of the vaccines is somewhat less. Government is saying, but the supply of the vaccine is less for the past 2 or 3 days. So we will educate all the pediatricians and other doctors to increase, get vaccinated, and using the mask and the social distance and the sanitizer, and it is our duty, primary duty, especially as a pediatrician, we can educate the grandparent and the parent and also children. I think many people will oblige the pediatricians. I hope that we will, Dr. Ismail sir can bring a
Yes, sir.
awareness.
Yes, sir, we will do that. On behalf of IPTNC, we will send across messages and posters.
Yeah, I think we should start doing that.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Pariniraman.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you, madam. Thank you,
Thank
madam.
you all.
sir.
Thank you all. Thank you
Bye,
all.
bye, bye. We leave the meeting.